The number zero was once a dangerous idea. On its surface, the concept seems simple. It represents nothing. Yet its arrival in mathematics was a revolution, fundamentally changing our power to calculate, reason, and model the world. The story of zero isn't just a footnote in the history of mathematics. It's a story about a major shift in human thought. It tracks our evolving ability to look directly at the concept of absence and give it a name, a symbol, and a job to do. This was not an easy or quick process. Initially, the need for something like zero was entirely practical, not philosophical. Imagine you are a merchant in ancient Babylonia, trying to keep your accounts straight. Without a zero, how do you write the number 301 to make it look different from 31? To solve this, the Babylonians used a placeholder, a blank space, or a pair of wedges to mark the empty spot. This was a clever organizational tool, a functional marker of absence, but it wasn't the number zero itself. From a psychological view, this was like acknowledging a gap without daring to look into it. They created a symbol that confirmed something wasn't there, but the concept of nothing as a value in its own right remained unborn. The true birth of zero as a number with its own identity happened in two different parts of the world. The Mayan civilization independently developed a symbol for zero, often a shell glyph, which they used in their advanced calendrical systems. Some evidence suggests this was tied to their cosmological views, hinting at an early connection between the finite and the infinite. However, a more philosophically powerful development grew out of India, where the idea of zero was born from metaphysical thought rather than just mathematical need. In Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, the concept of shunyata, or emptiness, was not a terrifying void but a substantive principle. This wasn't an empty nothingness to be feared, but a generative emptiness, a state of pure potential, like a silent studio waiting for a sculptor to begin. Because the culture already had a place for a productive nothing, it was possible for mathematicians like Brahmagupta in the 7th century CE to do the unthinkable, give zero formal rules. In his work, zero could be added and subtracted without changing the other number. A number subtracted from itself resulted in zero. For the first time, the idea of a potent void was given a concrete, operational form. When this powerful new number arrived in Europe, carried through the Islamic Golden Age by mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi, it was met with deep suspicion. The Western world was philosophically and theologically unprepared for it. The Arabic word for zero, sifar, became the root of our word cipher, which perfectly captures the dual way the concept was received. To a merchant, cipher was a code that unlocked immense computational power, a key to a new world of commerce. But to a theologian, it was a code that seemed to conceal a terrifying darkness, a structured void in God's perfect creation. Accepting this new number required a complete cognitive rewiring. It forced Western culture to confront the very concept it dreaded most, the void itself. When the number zero arrived in Europe, it brought with it a paradox that shook the foundations of Western thought. To a mind shaped by Greek philosophy and Christian theology, the concept was not an innovation, but a threat. How can nothing be counted as something? And what would such an idea do to the absolute power of God? The centuries of resistance to zero were not a failure of imagination. They were the logical outcome of a worldview that had no room for a structured nothingness. To understand this battle, we have to look at the structure of the Western mind at the time. The foundation of this fear was laid by ancient Greek philosophy. Thinkers like Aristotle worked to create a rational and understandable cosmos, a reality of substance, form, and clear cause and effect. In this system, a true void was a logical impossibility. For them, reality was a tightly connected chain of causality. A nothing would be a missing link, breaking the chain and making the universe irrational. This belief that nature abhors a vacuum was more than a physical theory. It was a psychological defense. The conscious mind seeks to build order and find meaning through connection. An absolute void represents the opposite, a state of non-relation that is deeply unsettling. The philosophical inheritance was absorbed directly into medieval European theology, where the resistance to zero became a divine mandate. The dominant theological framework was creation ex nihilo, the belief that an all-powerful God brought the universe into being out of nothing. In this view, God is the singular source of all existence, an expression of complete and total presence. From this standpoint, giving nothing the status of a number was philosophically incoherent and bordered on heresy. If zero was a thing with its own properties, it suggested a principle of non-being could exist independently of God, a dark twin to his creative light. It seemed to challenge God's absolute status as the foundation of all reality. To acknowledge zero was to admit a crack could exist in the foundation of a divinely ordered creation. Yet while philosophers and theologians debated, the practical power of zero was undeniable, and its champion was a merchant named Fibonacci. Having studied in North Africa, Fibonacci saw that the Hindu-Arabic numeral system was far superior to the clumsy Roman numerals used in Europe. In his 1202 book, Liber Abaci, the Book of Calculation, he didn't engage in abstract debates. He provided a stunningly practical demonstration of the system's power. His book was a manual for merchants, showing them how to easily calculate profit margins, interest, and debt. This was possible because of zero's role as a placeholder, which allowed for positional notation, the system where the number 9 can mean 9, 90, or 900 depending on its position. This turned complex multiplication and division, once Herculean tasks requiring an abacus, into simple processes manageable with simple pen and paper. For bankers and merchants, this was a revolution in speed and accuracy. Complex accounting became streamlined and reliable. The utility of zero created a cognitive bridge that forced the Western mind to adapt. Its undeniable success in the marketplace created a grassroots-level acceptance that gradually made philosophical fears obsolete. The old dread was eroded not by argument, but by overwhelming evidence of zero's value. Interestingly, a more nuanced view was emerging from within the Western tradition itself. Christian mystics following the apophatic path, or via negativa, argued that God is fundamentally beyond all human description. To approach the divine, they argued, one must abandon all finite categories and speak only of what God is not. From this perspective, the concept of nothingness wasn't a threat to God. It was a pillar of his ultimate mystery. The mathematical zero could be seen as a symbol of this idea, a functional absence reminding us that the most significant realities might lie beyond what we can positively name. This idea of a generative void can even be found in Genesis, where the primordial earth is described as formless and void, not an empty nothing, but a state of chaotic potential waiting for divine order. This reframes the entire conflict. While mainstream philosophy recoiled from zero, its eventual integration may have actually reinforced divine authority in a more sophisticated way. A God who masters the dynamic between being and non-being is of a higher order than one who simply creates from a blank slate. Psychologically, this mirrors the growth of an individual. A person achieves greater resilience not by repressing their flaws or fears, but by confronting them. The psychologist Carl Jung called these disowned parts of our personality the shadow. To become whole, the ego must turn and integrate the energy of this unknown, absent part of itself. Just as the Western worldview had to integrate the concept of nothing to become more robust, the individual must integrate their own inner void to become more complete. This protracted Western struggle highlights the power of a culture's core assumptions. In the East, traditions like Buddhism already had a foundational principle of emptiness, shunyata, so zero was never a source of conflict. The Western battle for zero, therefore, was a necessary conflict that forced a required psychological shift to finally make a space for nothing.
Now that we have traced its arrival, we are left with a philosophical substance of zero itself. In mathematics, its job is clear. It is the additive identity, a number that, when added to another, doesn't change it. It represents a quantity of zero. Yet this simple function hides a deeper paradox. To truly try and grasp the concept of zero is to push against the limits of language and logic. In zero, we have a symbol that points toward a reality our minds were not built to contain.
The central problem is one of language. Our grammar is built for a world of things. To speak of nothing is to immediately betray the concept, because the moment we name it, we make it a something. For instance, if you say, "There is nothing in the box," you are using the word nothing as the subject of the sentence, treating it like a tangible object that can be in the box. This is a logical knot our language cannot untie. This limitation reveals a boundary of the conscious mind. Try this simple experiment. Close your eyes and picture a complete and total void. It's impossible. The moment you try, you populate that void with the framework of your thought and the presence of yourself as the observer. The human mind is an instrument designed to make distinctions, to define things by separating this from that. It cannot be turned around to process its own absolute negation. It is at this boundary, where our logic begins to fray, that another way of understanding must take over. When a concept cannot be grasped directly, it must be approached through a symbol. This is where zero reveals its most important function. Across different mystical traditions, we find a shared idea of an ultimate reality that is beyond all description, a no-thingness from which everything else arises. This is what the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart called the Godhead, which he placed beyond the personal God of theology. It is the limitless Ein Sof of Kabbalah, the infinite wellspring from which the cosmos emerges. It is the Buddhist concept of shunyata, the dynamic emptiness that is the foundation of all form. It is the Tao that, once named, is no longer the true Tao. Zero is the perfect mathematical symbol for this indescribable source. On a number line, it is the point of origin between the positive and the negative, belonging to neither yet giving structure to both. It is a perfect representation of pure potentiality. In this way, zero acts as a signpost, pointing our minds toward a reality that cannot be contained by the mind itself. This symbolic weight yields an inescapable conceptual pairing. Is it possible to think of zero without also thinking of infinity? The two are locked in a necessary relationship, like light and darkness, each defining the other through opposition. In creating a symbol for absolute nothingness, we inevitably created a space for its conceptual polarity, absolute everything. The acceptance of a true point of origin implies a line can extend from it without end. The void and the totality are two sides of the same coin. The long struggle to understand a structured nothing was the necessary philosophical prerequisite for confronting a structured everything. The story of zero, therefore, does not end here. It transitions directly to the concept of infinity. If zero is the enigma of a structured nothing, then infinity is the paradox of a structured everything. It is one of the most challenging ideas the human mind has engaged, yet we often take it for granted. Like its opposite, zero, infinity is not a number in the conventional sense that you can count to. It is an idea that changes the rules of any system it enters. This link between zero and infinity is embedded in the logical structure of mathematics. The attempt to divide any number by zero, for example, destabilizes the entire system of arithmetic. If you were to say that 1 divided by 0 equals some number, k, it would imply that 1 equals k times 0, which means 1 must equal 0. This is a contradiction that would cause the entire edifice of mathematics to collapse. To protect its own integrity, the system leaves division by 0 undefined. Yet this is not a dismissal. As the number you divide by gets closer and closer to 0, the result grows without limit, gesturing toward an infinite result. The door to the infinite is paradoxically found in the void of the 0. This is why mathematical expressions like 0 divided by 0 or infinity minus infinity are called indeterminate forms. Their strangeness is not a failure of math, but a revelation. It shows that concepts like infinity are not static quantities, but depend on the context of the problem, a central insight of calculus. The paradoxes that arise when we treat infinity like a standard number are the logical symptoms of our finite minds grappling with a concept that transcends their own rules. Just as with 0, the formal entry of infinity into Western thought was not met unchallenged. This was especially true for the ancient Greeks, whose entire intellectual project was dedicated to reason, order, and clear boundaries, what they called peras. For them, the concept of the boundless, or apeiron, was a source of existential anxiety, a logical hazard that threatened to undermine their intelligible model of the universe. The philosopher Zeno of Elea gave this fear its sharpest form with a famous brain teaser, the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. His story was a demonstration of infinity's baffling nature. Zeno argued that the fleet-footed hero Achilles could never overtake a tortoise in a race if the tortoise was given a small head start. Why? Because to catch the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise began. In the time it takes him to do that, the tortoise has crawled a little further ahead, creating a new, smaller gap. Achilles must then cover that new distance, but in that time, the tortoise has moved again. This process repeats endlessly, implying that Achilles must complete an infinite number of tasks to catch his rival, and can therefore never do so. While modern math resolves this by showing the sum of these infinite smaller and smaller distances is in fact finite, Zeno's intent was to weaponize the concept of infinity to challenge the foundations of motion. For the Greek mind, his paradoxes framed the infinite not as a sublime reality, but as a conceptual trap that made the observable world seem irrational. In response, the great philosopher Aristotle formulated a brilliant compromise that would dominate Western thought for centuries. He distinguished between two kinds of infinity, potential and actual. A potential infinity is one of process. Like counting, you can always add one more number, and a line can always be extended. This was intellectually acceptable because it never required the mind to hold a completed, boundless set as a single object of thought. It kept the infinite as a future possibility. never a present reality. An actual infinity, however, a set containing all numbers, a truly completed endlessness, he rejected as unintelligible and paradoxical. For Aristotle, such a thing could not be measured or defined by reason, and was therefore relegated to the realm of the chaotic and unthinkable. The Greek preference for limit and form, peiras, speaks to the conscious mind's drive to create a stable, rational identity. The boundless, apeiron, in this context, becomes a symbol for the undifferentiated and potentially overwhelming unconscious. Just as the ego must draw a line between itself and the formless psychic world to create a coherent personality, the Greek intellectual project sought to establish a cosmos of reason, clearly bounded against the threat of chaos. From this perspective, rejecting an actual infinity was a psychological necessity. It was a mechanism to protect the structured, well-lit room of the conscious mind from the dissolving, engulfing power of the dark forest outside. By domesticating the infinite as a mere potential, the Greeks could acknowledge its existence while keeping its most challenging aspects safely at arm's length. A decision that would shape the Western relationship with the concept for nearly 2 millennia. While the Greek mind and the Western tradition that followed built philosophical walls to keep the infinite contained, this fear of the boundless was not a universal human response. In other parts of the world, infinity was explored with remarkable sophistication, not as a threat to reason, but as a component of reality. The ancient Jains of India, in particular, developed a conceptual framework for the infinite that predated similar formalizations in the West by centuries. Driven by a need to describe their intricate cosmology, Jain philosophy classified different sizes or orders of infinity. While lacking the rigor of modern mathematics, this ancient system demonstrated an early insight that infinity is not a single, monolithic concept. For the Jains, engaging with boundlessness was a way to map the immense scales of reality. To grasp how the Jains conceived of different sizes of infinity, it helps to think in terms of categories rather than a single number line extending forever. First, they considered a low-level infinity, a number so enormous it is effectively endless for a human, like counting every grain of sand on every beach in the world. Next, they identified a higher-level infinity, one that fits within a finite space. For example, imagine the infinite number of points that exist on a single 1-inch line. You can divide that inch in half forever, meaning an infinite number of points are contained within a very concrete and finite boundary. The Jains then took this logic even further. They intuited that the number of life forces, or jivas, existing in the cosmos was a fundamentally different and vaster type of infinity than the others. A truly boundless infinity with no beginning and no end. For them, this was not an abstract calculation so much as it was a cosmological necessity. By proposing these ascending orders of infinity, which they called ananta, they constructed a philosophical system capable of distinguishing between different scales of the immeasurable. Back in the West, the eventual shattering of the small contained cosmos came not from a mathematician, but from a philosopher, Giordano Bruno. His proposition of an infinite universe containing an infinite number of worlds was a direct assault on the closed, orderly sphere that Aristotle had described and that had dominated Western thought for centuries. This was a deeply heretical idea with immediate theological implications. An infinite creation suggested an infinite God, not a deity presiding over a finite world from the outside, but one who was fully present and coextensive with all of reality. This switch from a contained cosmos to a boundless one was obviously quite a disruption. It displaced humanity from its privileged position at the center of a known creation and set it adrift in an immeasurable and potentially indifferent universe. The loss of a defined cosmic structure can be seen as a primary source of modern existentialism. For if the universe is endless, then where is our place and what is our purpose? The collapse of the old model created a vacuum, demanding entirely new frameworks of meaning to make sense of humanity's new place in an unbounded reality. Where logic meets paradox, the true function of concepts like zero and infinity is revealed. Contemplating them is a bit like engaging with a Zen koan, a paradoxical riddle such as, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Which is designed not to be solved with reason, but to push our rational mind to its limit and provoke a shift in awareness. The attempt to visualize true nothingness or to fully comprehend a completed infinity stretches our intellect until it breaks. The mathematically undefined expressions, like dividing by zero, are not failures of logic, but are better understood as invitations to move beyond it. They mark borders of a threshold where the finite rules of our minds no longer suffice. The human mind, particularly the part that structures our conscious experience, evolved to operate in a world of finite, countable, and definable things. Its primary job is to create a coherent and manageable model of reality by separating this from that, a function essential for our safety and ability to predict the world around us. Infinity is the ultimate conceptual other to this drive for order. It represents something boundless and uncountable, an idea that refuses to be neatly placed into any of our mind's categories. The effort to reason about infinity with the tools of finite logic is, as the saying goes, like trying to pour the ocean into a cup. The resulting paradoxes are the inevitable overflow, signs that our conventional mental operations have reached their limit. Long before mathematics developed the tools to formally approach the infinite, humanity apprehended the idea through religious and archetypal symbols. The concept of God, as formulated in theological traditions, often serves as a kind of philosophical container for our intuition of the infinite. God is frequently described with infinite attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, and, as we've seen, is often said to arise from a preceding nothingness, or a conceptual zero. In this way, the human mind uses a symbolic figure to articulate a concept that it cannot directly compute or hold. This pattern persists even in our modern scientific understandings. The cosmological narrative of the Big Bang, for instance, is the modern story of creation through a lens of physics. From a singularity, a point of infinite density and zero volume, emerges the entire boundless and expanding universe. Here again, the foundational pairing of zero and infinity appears, whether we are trying to explain reality through theology or science. Modern physics even houses this paradox in the quantum vacuum, which is described not as an empty nothing, but as a plenum of probabilistic potential, a void that is simultaneously a field of constant generative energy. These concepts consistently lead us to the very edge of what is thinkable, forcing us against the limits of our own understanding. Having charted conceptual territories of zero and infinity, we arrive at their point of intersection, the boundary of the rational mind. These are not ideas that can be passively understood. They actively test the limits of the systems we use to make sense of the world. Their ultimate function is not to be solved like an equation, but to move us toward a mode of reality that our logical and linguistic tools are inadequate to describe. At the point where our reason falters, we discover the necessity of another kind of language, the symbolic and metaphorical transmission of myth and parable. Think of mathematics as a map of reality. The fact that expressions like 0 divided by 0 or infinity divided by infinity are officially labeled undefined or indeterminate is deeply significant. It is the map maker's honest admission that they have reached the edge of the known world. This is not a failure of the cartography, but a concession that the rules governing the finite charted lands are insufficient to handle the absolute void or the absolute infinite whole. This mathematical breakdown mirrors a larger psychological process. The conscious mind constructs a coherent and manageable model of the world, but certain experiences and concepts can destabilize this model. The undefined nature of these mathematical operations is the logical signature of such a moment, a point where the mind confronts a reality it cannot process through its existing categories, creating a space for other ways of understanding and relation to emerge. It is in this space beyond simple reason that the symbolic relationship between 0 and infinity comes into full view. 0, the unmanifest source, comes to represent a transcendent reality, a reality that exists beyond the physical and observable world. Infinity, in turn, represents an immanent expression of that source, the endless and diverse forms of creation unfolding within our reality. Their mystical unity suggests that the transcendent source is not separate from the world, but is expressed through it, much like the ocean is not separate from its waves, but is the inherent substance of them. The unmanifest void is the generative ground of every manifest thing. This dynamic perfectly mimics the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind, where the unconscious is not a simple storage bin for forgotten things, but the unmanifest potential from which our thoughts, images, and conscious life continuously arise. The idea of a boundless reality that underpins our own is a recurring feature of the human psyche. The psychologist Carl Jung identified such universal patterns as archetypes, which he believed arose from a collective unconscious, a layer of the mind inherited by all humans. The concept of infinity as a primary attribute of the divine, eternal, omnipresent, omniscient, is a powerful example of such an archetype. It is the mind's attempt to give a name and form to its deepest intuition of a reality that is larger than its own finite container. The natural response to sensing this boundless reality has often been a desire for union. The aim of many mystical paths is the dissolution of the limited, defined ego into a boundless consciousness. This is understood not as an annihilation, but as an expansion, letting go of the ego's rigid claim to be the whole of the personality, to connect with the larger psychic ground from which it came. This idea is reflected in cosmological myths, like the Hindu concept of cyclical yugas or Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, which frames existence not as a straight line, but as an endless cycle of emergence from and return to a universal source. Ultimately, 0 and infinity function as intellectual and psychological koans, pushing reason to its breaking point. In that breaking, they reveal limits of the logical mind alone. The paradoxes they create are not problems for us to solve, but guideposts that show our necessity of myth, symbol, and metaphor. It is through this mythopoetic faculty, our ability to think in stories, that the mind can articulate a nature of what lies beyond its own finite logic. As a brief review of all we've discussed, the final and perhaps greatest obstacle in confronting 0 and infinity is language itself. Our words were forged in a finite world. They evolved to name objects, describe actions, and build relationships between the things we can see and touch. When we aim this practical instrument at concepts of absolute absence or absolute totality, it begins to fracture. As we've seen, the simple act of saying there is nothing forces us to treat nothing as a subject, a thing that exists, which its very definition denies. Our language, built for a world of objects, is simply not equipped for this task. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that words get their meaning from their use in specific language games. Problems arise, he contended, when we use a word outside of its proper game. For example, the word nothing works perfectly in the descriptive game. There is nothing in the box, but creates a logical paradox in the possession game. I hold nothing in my hand. Concepts like zero and infinity push our linguistic tools to their absolute limit, demonstrating that words are not perfect pictures of reality, but are tools confined to human activity. To speak of them at all, we need a different kind of language, one that relies on paradox, symbol, and metaphor. Faced with this linguistic failure, both ancient mystics and modern mathematicians developed a similar powerful strategy, the apophatic approach, or the via negativa. This is a method of understanding something by systematically stating what it is not. Think of a sculptor who creates a statue by carving away all the marble that is not the statue. In theology, this is used to approach an understanding of God by denying all finite attributes. God is not limited, not bound by time, not fully comprehensible. This disciplined unsaying gestures toward a truth that positive language cannot capture. This same strategy appears in the supposedly rational domain of mathematics. An irrational number like pi is defined by what it is not, a number that cannot be expressed as a simple fraction. Georg Cantor's definition of an infinite set relies on a paradoxical property impossible for any finite collection. Its very nature is defined by its defiance of the rules of finitude. Both mystical inquiry and higher mathematics, upon reaching their limits, are forced to define their most challenging concepts by the void they leave in our logical systems. This brings us to a final crucial point, the necessity of story. The need for mythopoetic language, a way of thinking through myths and parables, is an ancient strategy for communicating deep, foundational knowledge. We see it in the East with the cosmological frameworks of the Jains, and in the West with the use of parables in the foundational texts of Christianity. These traditions understood that symbolic language works as a two-sided instrument. It is a key for those who are ready to understand, and a veil for those who are not. This is articulated in what is known as the Matthew principle. Whoever has will be given more. Whoever does not have, even what they have, will be taken from them. This is not a rule about wealth, but about cognitive receptivity. To have is to possess an internal framework, the eyes to see, that allows a parable to deepen one's insight. For those who listen with only a literal mind and superficial understanding, the parable's layers of meaning remain inaccessible. Like the word cipher that gave us our modern term for zero, a parable simultaneously reveals and conceals. It protects the integrity of a difficult message from being misunderstood or distorted by a mind that is not yet prepared for it. The things hidden since the foundation of the world are the deep structures of reality and the psyche. Like zero and infinity, they cannot be explained with simple statements. They must be shown through the symbolic action of a story. For messages of this order, which touch on the nature of being and consciousness, the story is the only adequate mode of communication. The parable is a key, but one that only fits a lock that has been properly prepared. For all others, it remains a simple, impenetrable story, safeguarding a truth they will not yet receive.